Nothing stays the same forever, even in a galaxy far, far away. When you look at Star Wars today, it's a behemoth of a franchise, represented in basically every type of media known to man. Movies, TV, toys, music, books, video games, comic books, board games, cards, food, appliances, furniture. But that wasn't always the case. There was a time when, despite the mega success of the original trilogy, Lucasfilm was slow to push into the multimedia realm, tempered by the disaster that was the Star Wars Holiday Special. But Star Wars' first real foray into new territory would be more unconventional, and with a partner looking to rehabilitate their image and finances. The project, a brand new theme park ride. The partner, the Walt Disney Company. The result would be Star Tours, opening 4 years after the end of Lucas's trilogy and in a time when both Star Wars and Disneyland were looking for a direction. At the time, it was a surprising and unconventional partnership. Disney had, after all, nothing to do with the production and distribution of Lucas's movies. In fact, their jealousy of Star Wars' success had driven them to several disastrous sci-fi projects of their own. Looking back today, and we can see it as the catalyst of what would decades later become Disney Star Wars. But why did these two mega brands team up? What is the story behind the creation of Star Tours? How has Disney changed the ride over the years as an ever-evolving nexus of corporate synergy? And why did this one motion simulator ride become the origin of one of the film industry's biggest purchases ever? This is the history of Star Tours, the ride that changed Disney. I don't think I really need to go over the general history of Star Wars. If you're here, you probably know about one of the biggest franchises in the history of the world. But our story begins in the strangest period of the franchise's history. 1983's Return of the Jedi had capped off Luke's story, but with Lucas making sure to emphasize his original trilogy as parts 4, 5, and 6, fans were waiting for more entries in what would be known as the Skywalker Saga. Of course, that wouldn't happen for another decade and a half, as Lucas had become more interested in new technology and producing an array of projects instead of more Star Wars movies. In the meantime, Star Wars needed to go somewhere to stay alive. This was largely accomplished by what came to be known as the Expanded Universe, starting with the novel Splinter of the Mind's Eye in 1978. But these entries, no matter their popularity with fans, essentially existed on the fringes of mainstream knowledge, and the EU wouldn't really gain steam until the 90s. In addition, Marvel's Star Wars comics ran from 1977 through 1986. This meant that the late 80s came to be known as the dark times for the franchise, as even the scraps of new material had run dry. Caravan of Courage in 84, Battle for Endor in 85, the brief Droids and Ewoks cartoons had also ended by 86. Lucas and company were looking for the next big thing to get people excited about Star Wars. Most of the 1980s also saw the Walt Disney Company searching for their next big hit after enduring a series of failures and shakeups behind the scenes. You can kinda think of this video as a quasi-sequel to my pieces on the Don Bluth Disney War and the death of the Disney Renaissance, as we are squarely in the moment when Disney was at their lowest point. With the dark age of animation pulling in low profits, Don Bluth Animation beating them at the box office, and Michael Eisner coming in to shake up the entire organization. As a brief recap, Disney shareholders Roy E. Disney and Sid Bass had used their power to bring in Michael Eisner, president and COO of Paramount Pictures, into Disney as CEO and chairman alongside Frank Wells as president in 1984. Eisner, in turn, quickly onboarded Jeffrey Katzenberg, also from Paramount, as chairman of Walt Disney Studios, and Roy E. Disney took over as chairman of Walt Disney Feature Animation. Among the various massive changes they made was Eisner's attempt to use brands not created by Disney to help re-establish their popularity as a studio. Disney had been one of the many studios to turn down Lucas's Star Wars pitch in the 70s, and, after massive success, was clearly aware of their missed opportunity. Disney films like The Black Hole and Tron were created to ride the wave of sci-fi popularity, but never reached Star Wars heights. Now, a decade on, Disney had the chance to have a piece of the Star Wars pie, and not just an imitation. This was all possible, of course, because Lucasfilm and Star Wars Corporation Inc. controlled the rights to Star Wars, and not 20th Century Fox, which simply served as distributor. In addition, Lucas and Eisner had a pre-existing working relationship, as it was Eisner as head of Paramount who greenlit Lucasfilm's Raiders of the Lost Ark under Lucas's terms. According to Eisner, George came over to my house and he said, "Let's make the best deal they've ever made in Hollywood." And apparently, they did. With Eisner now at Disney, Lucas was much more open to working with the studio that had previously turned him down. Revamping Disney parks was one of Eisner's priorities as president, with both Disneyland and Walt Disney World severely stagnant due to the company's larger financial woes. At the time, these parks accounted for 70% of the corporation's revenue, but they simply weren't given love and attention. At this point, the last major new ride at Disneyland was Big Thunder Mountain Railroad, which had opened in 1979. Eisner wanted new rides at Disneyland, and also had ambitions for a brand new park within Walt Disney World Resort, this time with a Hollywood theme. That land would become Disney MGM Studios Park, eventually rebranded Disney Hollywood Studios in 2008. But this new land focused on the movies would need new rides built off popular properties. Some of the films recently had not connected with the audience, and they're not the real crowd pleasers, said Imagineer Tony Baxter. When you create a ride based on a movie, it has to be one the audience dearly loves. And with so many of Disney's animated and live-action films failing to connect in the previous decade, the company would need to turn somewhere else for successful franchises with passionate fans. Nobody's gonna go on a Condor Man ride. I'm sorry. Where are my Condor freaks at? So what was all the rage in the early 80s? Well, Star Wars, E.T., Indiana Jones, and more in the new wave of blockbusters. Interest in Star Wars at Disney had actually started just before Eisner's arrival, with then-President Ron Miller considering Steven Spielberg and George Lucas. But with Spielberg so heavily connected to Universal Studios at the time, a relationship that would eventually result in the E.T. ride, Disney turned to Lucas. The Star Wars creator met with Miller and Imagineering legend Baxter, but with Lucas's pre-existing relationship with Eisner, the change in leadership didn't negatively affect negotiations. Lucas himself had a lengthy history with Disneyland, visiting the park on the second ever day it was open at 11 years old. Of course, as I covered in my video on Tomorrowland a few years ago, this section of Disneyland was severely underwhelming on opening day due to dwindling funds and time running out. Lucas himself was underwhelmed by the area, saying, "I wanted to have an involvement in Tomorrowland. I thought that was a portion of the park that had always been a little less than it could have been." So Star Wars would replace Adventure Through Inner Space, an Omnimover ride originally opened in 1967, bringing Tomorrowland into a more sci-fi future than what Walt Disney had originally intended, with his more practical and heavily corporate-sponsored vision for the area. As for Lucas, it's clear that he had always wanted to work with Disney, discussing how the company rejected his Star Wars pitch originally. I think Disney would have accepted this movie if Walt Disney were still alive. Walt Disney not only had vision, but he was also an extremely adventurous person. He wasn't afraid. The deal? Lucas would be paid $1 million per attraction, per park, per year, including not just the upcoming Star Tours, but the eventual Indiana Jones Stunt Spectacular! And Indiana Jones Adventure. Kids, passive income is important in these financially difficult times. With the contract signed, it was time to bring Star Wars to life in a brand new format.
Lightspeed to Endor!
Soon after joining Disney, Eisner and Frank Wells asked Disney's Imagineers to pitch their concepts for new rides, and among these were Tony Baxter's idea for what would become Star Tours, as well as Splash Mountain, with both greenlit during presentation. However, the new ride would go through several iterations before becoming the journey we know today. At first, the idea was that this Star Wars ride would be a roller coaster where riders could make choices that sent the coaster onto different tracks. Of course, this was super impractical and would need a massive amount of space. But when Imagineers found out about Rediffusion Simulation's motion simulator, originally designed to help trainee pilots experience the real effects of flights, they knew how they could bring Star Wars to life. Now, the ride could fully immerse audiences in the galaxy far, far away, instead of simply theming being around a more generic roller coaster. Of course, this being a Disney attraction, the ride needed to be more family-friendly than the films, and thus was born a peaceful trip around the galaxy gone wrong. No wars, just tours. And seriously, I can't even count how many theme park rides are centered on the idea that you've come to do a normal thing, and then everything goes wrong. Like, that's theme park ride creation 101. But here, the ride is simply that you and your fellow passengers have booked an intergalactic trip that falls to pieces. Star Wars is, generally speaking, aimed at all audiences, but there's still some restrictions given ratings and that audiences need to purchase a ticket to experience some slightly more mature thrills. Anyone can walk onto a ride if they're tall enough, so letting people know that the ride is for older audiences simply isn't enough. Disney would go on to learn that lesson with the insanely scary extraterrestrial alien encounter. RIP. Gone before your time. So, Star Tours carries the essence of the original trilogy, but with a lighter touch. The most important element of keeping that tone is our intrepid rookie pilot droid, Rex, voiced by the late great Paul Reubens. With Rex stammering and sweating at the controls, everything feels just a little less serious. The Star Tours motion simulator has the capability of not just tilting up and down, but moving 15 feet in every direction, all powered by pneumatic pressure hydraulics, expanding themselves slowly to keep the ride moving. Meanwhile, the visuals are brought to life by a 70mm film projector screen, as video was simply not up to standard at the time. But film reels age, so as a solution, Star Tours used a loop cabinet, created by Disney innovator Ub Iwerks. The cabinet allows film to run through a large container without ever rubbing against itself, which would happen in a normal film projector. As such, film reels don't break down, scratch, and deteriorate from use as quickly, allowing for constant reuse with high-fidelity image. Of course, it's not all Disney who was calling the shots. Star Tours is the result of Disney Imagineering and Industrial Light and Magic, a division of Lucasfilm, coming together during production. With ILM's Dennis Muren at the helm, a series of filmed miniatures and matte paintings were spliced together to appear as one continuous experience, with bright flashes, big objects that fill the frame, and moments of darkness hiding the cuts between each shot. Alfred Hitchcock, eat your heart out. The end result is a perfect marriage between ILM's filming of the visuals laid out in the window in front of riders, and Imagineering's programming of the simulator, working in perfect concert with each moment on screen, coordinated by an extremely detailed script. Every moment of the speeder is designed to emulate what's seen on screen, not just bumps and jolts from explosions, but tilting you back subtly to emulate the jump to light speed, and the slow tilted rise of a tractor beam to let the hydraulics regain their pressure for more movement. After we matched the capability of the simulator to a list of Star Wars stunts, their running order became a dictate of what capabilities were available after the completion of the preceding stunt, said Baxter, meaning that those hydraulics simply couldn't do certain big stunts in a row, and would need to repressurize at certain points, all hidden by the simulations. Star Tours would have a runtime of 4 minutes and 35 seconds, the maximum amount of time before guests would begin getting increasingly nauseous. But those minutes are filled with action. The ride goes from chaos at the launch station to busting through icy comets, to being trapped by a Star Destroyer, to finally participating in the Rebel Alliance's attack on the Death Star. The trench run at the ride's finale was essentially a compromise between Disney and Lucasfilm, as Lucas's team didn't want to recreate any moment from the films for the ride, while Tony Baxter and team thought the ride needed a well-known climax to satisfy riders. In the end, Disney's trench run vision won out, and the original Star Tours ends with one of the series' most iconic moments, before riders are returned to their station in one last near crash. Given that the ride was essentially programmable to any visual, Star Tours presented the possibility for changes at any given time, with Lucas saying, "This will give us an advantage in being able to upgrade the ride after a certain period of time." Oh George, you loved messing with your creations long before the special editions. But for now, Star Tours opened on January 9th, 1987 at Disneyland, before having duplicate launches at Tokyo Disneyland and Hollywood Studios in 1989, and Disneyland Paris in 1992. Disneyland would celebrate by staying open for 3 straight days, with the ride a hit and helping to breathe new life into not just the old Tomorrowland, but the stagnant park as a whole. The following decade saw lots of new rides open at Disneyland and Disney parks around the world, but Tomorrowland would struggle once again. The area would eventually be subject to the disastrous revamp that was New Tomorrowland in 1998. But did you know there was a moment when Tony Baxter and company pitched for the entire area to be changed into Lucasport? With gleaming crystal buildings, it wasn't exactly Star Wars Land, but it was close. And it's indicative of Disney's desire to fully embrace the galaxy far, far away long before the launch of Galaxy's Edge. For a decade, Star Tours existed crystallized in the past, alongside the franchise's most mainstream work, with Star Wars slowly pushing into a more hardcore fan base with comics, books, and video games expanding the galaxy without any new films. The film we had in there was working just great, said Imagineer Tom Fitzgerald. So, from the park perspective and the guest perspective, why would we change it? However, the release of The Phantom Menace in 1999 quickly highlighted Star Tours' outdated nature. Like the franchise as a whole, Star Tours would no longer stay stuck in the past. Now, I love Disneyland. Growing up in Southern California, I've been going all my life, and while I wasn't fully aware of what the changes to the park meant in my early years, I experienced a lot of them. And the strangest thing about Disneyland is that while every aspect is designed to remove guests from reality and place them into a carefully curated new land of imagination, ride technology from half a century ago exists right alongside the most cutting-edge innovations, subconsciously forcing guests to realign their suspension of disbelief with each ride's capabilities. And somehow, the constant upgrades present in each new ride or renovation doesn't render the old rides obsolete in the minds of riders. If it did, every new ride would require a park-wide overhaul. Star Tours in particular stood untouched for decades, with its safety videos and queue feeling extremely 80s. However, there was always something charming about this to me. It was evocative of what the original Star Wars felt like, long before even the prequels expanded that vision. Also, it reminded me of Next Generation, which I watched a lot of as a kid. But eventually, the time came for Star Tours to keep up with both the new vision of its franchise and the corporation that housed it. While discussions of a Star Tours update began in 1998, the project then known as Star Tours 2 wasn't officially announced until Star Wars Celebration 3 in April 2005. Mostly that's because the Imagineering team decided to wait until the prequels were finished before deciding what worlds and characters would be featured in the upgraded ride. And between its announcement in 2005 and its official closure for a renovation on July 27, 2010 in Disneyland and September 7th in Hollywood Studios, behind-the-scenes discussions debated what should or shouldn't be in the new version of the ride. The primary source of debate was where the ride would take place in the larger Star Wars timeline. The original ride had been designed to fit into the films without disrupting them, but with so many new possibilities, Lucas would need to be more comfortable with a loose approach to the canon he'd essentially acted as shepherd of for decades. Of course, the more than 2 decades that passed also brought new technologies. The new ride, titled Star Tours The Adventures Continue, is in 3D and uses digital projection now instead of 70mm film. No more need for a loop cabinet. This allowed for a sharper, clearer image, but also created greater flexibility in what could be shown. Star Tours could now offer continuous new experiences for riders, but instead of swapping out film every few years as was originally considered, every ride became a modular experience. The new Star Tours is broken up into 4 segments, each with many alternate versions. There's an opening attack by the Empire or First Order, a first planet, a hologram message, and the final coordinates for the Rebellion or Resistance. Altogether, there are 21 randomized segments, which means 700 different combinations are possibilities. When this update was first discussed, the idea was to firmly place the new Star Tours in the timeline of the prequels, changing the original's Starspeeder 3000 to The Adventure Continues Starspeeder 1000. That's like a whole 2,000 models earlier. And while Disney has said the ride takes place at some time between episodes 3 and 4, none of that really makes sense. And as time went on and more characters and locations from the sequel trilogy were added, that continuity completely breaks down. Still, what this new update meant was that not only did Star Tours have new life breathed into it that could be consistently updated to bring in more riders, it proved that Disney was willing to listen to Lucas's new ideas and partner with the Star Wars franchise again. By this point, Disney had produced very little Star Wars material outside of Star Tours and its update. However, Lucasfilm had worked with various partners to bring their ever-growing franchise to life. In the years since Star Tours first opened, Star Wars had become a massive empire far removed from that dark time of the late 80s. Outside of 20th Century Fox, Lucasfilm had many different partner companies. Both Kenner and Hasbro had gotten toy licenses at different points. Dark Horse produced decades of comics. Clone Wars was released on Cartoon Network. LucasArts partnered with just about every video game company until the deal with EA. Lucasfilm's leveraging of every medium kept Star Wars alive until the prequels came along. Afterward, the franchise still grew, but it seemed like there wasn't much left in terms of mainstream Star Wars stories. Of course, we all know what happens next. It was during the opening of Star Tours The Adventure Continues that the idea of Lucas selling the property to Disney was first discussed, with CEO Bob Iger, who had replaced Eisner and had an existing relationship with Lucas due to producing the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles at Paramount, pitching the sale over breakfast at Disney World. In October 2012, the Walt Disney Company bought Lucasfilm for $4.05 billion and announced that it would produce 3 new films, with the first film, Star Wars The Force Awakens, released in 2015. But that was just the tip of the iceberg. Now, everything Star Wars related would be moved away from all those different partners and under the Disney umbrella. And in 2019, Galaxy's Edge, an entire Star Wars themed land, would open at both Disneyland and Hollywood Studios, echoing the dual launch of Star Tours at these same locations. The areas are a strange mix of classic Star Wars feel and the characters defined by Disney's sequel trilogy, which, I mean, of course they are. Those are all created 100% under the mouse's control. But there's also a lot of Star Tours DNA in Galaxy's Edge. Smuggler's Run is essentially a more interactive Star Tours with motion simulation and digital projection pioneered on that Tomorrowland ride. As for Star Tours itself, it still exists in Tomorrowland, separated from the main Star Wars area on the other side of the park and essentially moving all Star Wars theming back out of that sci-fi land, which had temporarily flooded it post-Disney purchase. Tomorrowland is, once again, left without a direction. And Star Tours, despite its constant updates, now feels very out of step with the modern Disney Star Wars branding that Galaxy's Edge is all about. Still, Star Tours' continued popularity proves that the franchise appeals to fans not because of Disney's ongoing expansions, but because of the essence of that galaxy far, far away. As for Lucas himself, he's made it clear how displeased he's been with the direction of his baby. During the sale, Lucas included his treatments for the next 3 episodes, which he had prepped before moving forward with Disney. And once Star Wars was sold, all 3 were tossed in the trash. And Lucas, who had hoped he would be able to consult in some way, had no say. Of course, this frustrated Lucas, who had always involved himself in the finer details and sign-offs of Star Wars properties. I mean, the man once completely derailed an in-development Darth Maul video game because he wanted the villain to be friends with a character that existed centuries later in continuity. They're friends. Lucas would eventually say that he viewed his Star Wars creations as his children, and that he had sold them to the white slavers that were Disney. Yikes. Talking about Disney Star Wars on the internet can be a very loaded subject. The mix of nostalgia, fan dissatisfaction, and a sense of ownership meeting actual ownership seems to spark constant debate and intense anger. Which is a real shame because, while properties like Star Wars continue to exist to make corporations money, their reason for being popular is because they create joy in fans. The point of this video wasn't to try to find where a franchise seemingly went wrong, or what made the good old days so good, or to make a case for Star Wars today, but instead to trace how strange a path something like Star Wars has traveled over the years. And how, while plenty of criticism can be leveled at any new entry in a franchise that's constantly under the microscope of fans, each will also have plenty of people that love it. Yet the nature of any franchise means that a new entry inevitably sparks another, and a product intent on making money can't stay still. Personally, I would love if the original Star Tours would return for special nights. I don't see how it couldn't be possible. But for now, Old Rex will have to be a cantina DJ, reminding us of the good old days and the never-ending Ouroboros of fandom. Star Tours, like Star Wars as a whole, must constantly move forward under the fear of growing irrelevant and not continually proving that $4 billion purchase as worthwhile. And with more Star Tours updates promised for 2024, the end is not nearly in sight. Whether that means a nostalgic ride permanently brought into the present, or a never-ending expansion of canon, nothing stays the same forever, even in a galaxy far, far away. Thanks for watching today's video, and my first ever video about Star Wars. For a long time in the history of this channel, I have been uninterested in talking about Star Wars. But in recent years, I've done several videos that have tangentially touched on the subject, and of course have focused a lot on Disney. Specifically, my videos about Tomorrowland, Tron, and the death of the Disney Renaissance have all somewhat had something to do with Star Wars, as it's had an impact on all of those stories. And I guess you could also say my videos about Sorcerer and Christine also have somewhat to do about Star Wars. And while there have been so many videos made about the movies, the Star Tours ride to me is a really interesting and strange little side project in this larger franchise. And over the years, it's always remained that strange cousin to the larger investments that have happened with Star Wars. Because, as I talked about in the video, as Disney has pumped more and more money into the franchise it now owns, Star Tours seems like this strange relic of the past that continues to be updated to remain somewhat relevant for today, but now sits in the shadow of Galaxy's Edge. And as I said in the video, I've been going to Disneyland all my life, and as long as I can remember, I've been a fan of Star Tours itself. Because I started watching Star Wars at such a young age, going there and getting on that ride was everything I ever wanted as a kid. It really did feel like you got to be in the movie for at least a few minutes, as well as when you were walking through that whole queue. And I really do like the new Star Tours The Adventure Continues and all the different additions they've made to it, because it's such a great cutting-edge motion simulator ride. It just functions super well, and to me all the modular aspects of never knowing exactly what you're gonna get are super fun. And of course you can go on over and over and always have somewhat different experiences. Although that may mean that the section that you really want to go on just doesn't show up for you, no matter how hard you try. But that's what keeps riders coming back these days, I guess. And as you can see from the many different videos that I've done over the years, I really do enjoy exploring strange different aspects of the Disney company's evolution over the years, especially the stranger and less successful portions of their history, because there have been plenty of things made by both Disney and other people over the years that are all about their major successes. To me, failures and struggles are just so much more interesting to talk about. And I have plenty more videos in the future that will talk about those aspects of Disney. Until then, I would love to hear your thoughts about Star Tours, and about Galaxy's Edge as well. Like I said, talking about Disney Star Wars on the internet is just asking for people to be really toxic, but I hope that this video was not that at all. After all, Star Wars and theme park rides overall are meant to bring joy to people that experience them. As always, a huge shout out to my patrons for their continued support. If you'd like to be a patron, it's only $1 a month for early access to every video and exclusive Patreon-only reviews, with a new one voted on by patrons every month. So until next time, I hope that you're taking care of yourselves and enjoying the best aspects of that galaxy far, far away.